Hey guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is the Chapter 8 AP Biology lecture, and this is really our beginnings of our conversations about metabolism. So, of course, we got to define it first, make sure you understand the definition. Apologize about the background here, so it makes things a little bit difficult to read. But essentially, when we talk about metabolic activity, we talk about someone having a high metabolism, a low metabolism. What we're talking about is the totality or all of the organism's chemical processes. So a lot of what we're talking about is how do we process food, how do we process energy, how do we do work with the energy that we take in. Here's a map that shows, tries to represent anyway, all of our metabolic pathways. There's a lot. So there are two different types of pathways when we talk about metabolic action. Again, remember that's ways that we process energy. One of the ways that we can deal with food, for example, is a catabolic pathway. Anytime you see catabolic, you're breaking things down. So you're taking, maybe you eat something for breakfast. Your body's going to break those complex molecules into smaller ones, and as a result, you're going to release energy. That's this process called cellular respiration that we're going to talk a ton about over the coming days. Anabolic pathways are going to consume energy and build big molecules from smaller ones. So you may have heard the term anabolic steroids, the steroids that most folks take, especially in the steroid era of baseball. In the 90s and early 2000s, those were anabolic pathways because those steroids were designed to help them build bigger muscles. Don't forget that energy is defined as the ability to do work. Kind of maybe a more specific definition of energy in this specific context is the ability to rearrange a collection of matter. Of course, we've got kinetic potential and activation energy. So activation energy is going to be the energy that it takes to push a reaction forward. Kind of a classic example of activation energy and energy transfer in general is somebody climbing up and jumping off a diving board. Potential energy on the diving board, kinetic energy coming off the diving board. I guess it doesn't really talk about activation energy. We're going to talk about activation energy with enzymes, which is the lab that you guys did yesterday. Of course, kinetic energy is the energy of motion. We all know that. Potential energy is going to be stored energy that, again, does have the ability to do work. We're just not currently using it. Here's activation energy. Kind of gave you that definition a few minutes ago. It's the energy needed to convert potential to kinetic. That's kind of the textbook definition there. So in this example of a bomb, the activation energy is the fuse, and the potential energy is the explosives contained within the bomb. So again, that activation energy is going to push the reaction forward. Of course, energy transformation is going to be governed by the laws of thermodynamics. These hopefully are a review for you at this point. Also known as conservation of energy. The first law, energy can be transferred, transformed. We can't create energy, nor can we destroy it. Second law of thermodynamics is often called entropy. With each energy transfer, essentially chaos increases. There's our definition of entropy. So, and we also know that with each transformation, the energy loses efficiency. So that's sort of the idea that we're talking around here. So to summarize those two laws, the quantity of energy is constant, but the quality of energy is not. We're always losing quality. We're never losing quantity. Unless we're performing nuclear reactions and turning energy into matter, and that's a whole different set of circumstances altogether. Oops. So how does life overcome entropy? How does life overcome chaos? We use energy from the environment to drive us forward. Whether we consume that energy or whether we're a plant and we produce that energy from light, we take an energy input to overcome the chaos that should follow. So one of the big ideas in this section is the idea of free energy. So free energy is going to be the portion of a system's energy that can perform work. It's going to be, well, you guys know that some of the energy in a system is not going to be available to do anything. It's going to be stored as potential energy. Maybe it's wrapped up in cold that's hundreds of feet below the surface or something along those lines. So this is something that we definitely are going to have to calculate. Pretty easy algebraic calculations. The free energy is represented by a G because it's another term for it is Gibbs free energy. It's a scientist that sort of came up with this idea. So we're going to have to take the calculation for the free energy available to do work. We've got the total energy, and then we've got to subtract out the entropy. And entropy, as you know, is dependent on temperature. Think about, again, entropy is chaos. So think about molecules in a gas. At low temperatures, those molecules are going to move around and collide occasionally. At high temperatures, they're going to bounce around like crazy, and then they're going to have a lot of collisions, and there's going to be more chaos. Excuse me. So if the system has more free energy, it's less stable. That makes sense. It's got greater capacity to do work. So when a system has a lot of free energy, things are going to happen. So think about, there are a lot of ways that you could apply this to even social movements. When there's a lot of available energy, when people are really engaged, and people are really committed to a cause, you can get a lot done. When people aren't passionate and aren't engaged and don't care about something, then their system is going to be pretty stable. They're not going to have a lot of free energy, and not a lot's going to get done. So in chemistry, you learned about spontaneous chemical reactions. Vinegar and baking soda produces a spontaneous reaction. We've talked about carbonic acid with respect to coral reefs, but so vinegar baking soda creates carbonic acid that then spontaneously decays into carbon dioxide and water. So that doesn't take an input of energy. So a system is unstable. It's going to change spontaneously to reach a more stable state. The change provides free energy for work. Make sure you check the textbook on page 147. It says on the screen 146. That's a typo. So section 8.2 discusses these processes, kind of gives a little bit more math, and there are some good graphical representations that'll really help, I think, bring this concept home. So this picture comes out of your book. Excuse me. Again, we're trying to show spontaneous change. So the a lot of free energy. The diver walks off spontaneously. They're going to fall. So we've got gravitational motion there. Another example of spontaneous change is going to be diffusion. We called this the fart phenomenon when we talked about diffusion and osmosis. In nature, particles spread out. They don't want to be shoulder to shoulder. They want to have space. So diffusion would be an example of a spontaneous process. And then we've got some chemical reactions that are spontaneous decay. That vinegar baking soda one that I was talking about with carbonic acid would be an example of that. So of course, chemical reactions are the source of energy for living systems, so that's why you need to take chemistry before you can understand upper level biology. And all chemical reactions are based on free energy, whether a reaction is exergonic or endergonic or spontaneous, or many of the different terms that you had to memorize as chemistry students. Those all relate back to the amount of free energy. An exergonic reaction is going to have a net release of free energy, so you're going to see a temperature change there. Endergonic reactions absorb free energy from the surroundings. Again, you typically see a different temperature change there, so I leave that to you to think about which one would correspond with the two different reactions. Hopefully you remember that from Chem 1. reaction diagrams that show exergonic and endergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions, remember, are going to release energy. So our free energy originally in the reactants or on the reactants side of things is much higher than it is after the reaction happens. Here's our endergonic reaction where we have to absorb energy from the environment, or maybe we need an enzyme to lower the activation energy, or we need energy to jumpstart the process. That's sort of what that would look like. So the free energy is low. The products have a large amount of free energy. Think about reversible reactions that you see. We're going to see things go back and forth, back and forth. A couple of examples. Exergonic reaction that we're studying currently is respiration, and endergonic reaction that we just finished looking at is photosynthesis. A couple different types of work that we see. Remember, energy is the ability to do work, so what are we talking about doing? We could be talking about contracting muscles and movement and things like that. We could be talking about pumping hydrogen ions across a membrane. We could be talking about pumping sodium and potassium across a membrane, any of those types of things. Or we could be making polymers, making things like proteins and things along those lines. So this is probably not something that you've considered before, but our bodies are very good at coupling reactions together. So if there's a reaction that needs energy, it's probably going to happen at a location next to a reaction that releases energy. That's just efficient. We're often going to use ATP to bond those reactions together. So here's an example. This is essentially the sodium-potassium pump. We've got a membrane protein. It's got a solute that's pushing things out, that's pulling things in. Next to that, we've got, ATP is phosphorylating the transport protein. See that phosphate group right there and right there. So the ATP activates this protein. As a result of the process, it gets dephosphorylated, and we end up with ADP and a free phosphate. Excuse me. Over here, we're going to use ATP to couple an opposite reaction where we've got this motor protein that's doing mechanical work. And again, it's going to be hydrolyzed, so we're going to be dephosphorylated and we're going to release ADP and phosphate. So these two reactions are going to feed off of one another, and they're going to push each other forward. Okay, ATP. I called this B- on the slide because you need to know it. I'm not directly testing you over what ATP stands for, but you better remember it from your freshman year. So ATP, adenosine triphosphates, made of adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphates, so triphosphates. Not a shock there. Here's a couple of different pictures. So we've got ATP here. Again, there's our adenine, there's our ribose, there are our 3 phosphates. If we hydrolyze this, put it in water, we're going to lose one of our phosphates, and we're going to release energy. The way I teach it to my freshmen is it's like a glow stick. You snap this reaction and energy comes out. Or I'm sorry, you snap this bond and energy comes out. Just like when you snap a glow stick, it releases energy. Ball and stick model. Again, just a three-dimensional, attempting to be a three-dimensional representation of it. So our adenine, our ribose, and then our phosphate groups stick off. Key to ATP is the 3 phosphate groups. They are negatively charged, so they're going to be unstable. They're going to repel one another. That works out well for us. And essentially what ATP is going to do is transfer a phosphate group to something else and turn whatever that something else is on. Here's an example, and check out the free energy calculations. Without ATP, the delta G, the change in free energy, is positive 3.4. With ATP, it's negative 7.3. So we get a negative free energy change by using ATP. We'll pick up here in lecture 2.